The Darkstream, Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and Castalia House. You know, my recent Darkstream, where I addressed how Jordan Peterson was against people honoring their tradition, taking pride in their culture, preserving the traditions of their forefathers and passing them on to their descendants. And, you know, for the first time, I actually took personal affront to the evil philosophy that Peterson is pushing through his Jordanetics program. But a lot of people have said, well, you know, he's doing so much good. You know, he's helping these poor young men who are assailed by feminism, under pressure from SJWs, and they don't know what to do. They're raised by single mothers. They don't have masculine role models, and what he's doing is really great for them. The problem is, that's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. What he is trying to do is he is trying to neuter them. Jordan Peterson is not raising young men to defend the West. He is not raising young men to become heroes. He is teaching them that they are the measure of man. They are the measure of good and evil. They set the standards. They do whatever they want. How is that any better than what the SJWs are telling them? The indoctrination that Jordan Peterson is providing through this philosophy of Jordanetics is poisonous. It's like raising a kid on junk food. You can't be surprised if all you feed a kid is junk food, is that he lives, but he grows up to be fat and soft and weak. You know, and people keep saying, oh, well, I like this about him, and I like that about him. So what? That's totally irrelevant. And the thing is, we now know that he is not only an intellectual fraud, he's not only an intellectual charlatan, but he's also a complete fraud when it comes to his own career. You know, people are saying, oh, but he's so popular and so many people like his videos and it's just this organic phenomenon. That's a total load of crap. Jordan Peterson is no more a self-made man than Ben Shapiro is. Jordan Peterson was recruited to help write the UN's report on sustainable development. He was brought in to polish the narrative for a report that was putting John Podesta on the panel of eminent persons. And this was back in 2012. This was long before Peterson got famous. And so if you look at the timeline, you can see that this is somebody who was raised up in order to fulfill a mission. And what that mission was to attempt to diffuse the growing trend towards nationalism. It says right in the report, the very report that he helped author, the very report that he even says, he brags that he rewrote the narrative. And it says in that report, which you can read, look it up. It's the report published in 2013. It's called the UNHLP, and it's the equivalent of it used to be called Agenda 21. I think now it's called Agenda 2030. And the idea is to eliminate world poverty by 2030. And it's all about fostering immigration. And one of the things that it says is that millions of people can have their mindsets altered. That the thinking of millions of people can be altered. Now, who do you think is doing that altering? The guy who is altering the mindset is the guy who has been raised up as the number one most important public intellectual in the world. There's a commenter who's saying, he must be a threat to you. He is a threat to you. He is a threat to everyone. He is a threat to the entire world. Because he is the globalist's pet psychologist. And that's why he is out there preaching this gospel, this false gospel of atomized individualism. And he is one of the most serious enemies of the West. He is actively, intentionally being utilized to destroy nationalism across the West by trying to convince people that Christianity is just myth and metaphor, that moral standards are entirely subjective, and that the future is the one world government ruled over by the UN for whom he works. And the thing is, if you look at his old videos, you can see that he's even had a complete stylistic makeover. You know, he used to be, I wouldn't say overweight, but, you know, a little bit. I mean, he kind of showed his age. He looked a bit softer and so forth. And now he's suddenly, you know, he grew the facial hair. The hair is a little bit more stylish. He's got sort of that haunted prophet look. This is not an accident. And so the idea that he is a good person trying to help people is absolutely and utterly false. If you don't believe that John Podesta is just a good person trying to help people, if you don't believe that David Cameron is just a good person trying to help people, then why on earth would you believe that Jordan Peterson is? Because he cries on stage? Because he tells you he cares? I mean, this guy is much worse than I thought. And I thought that he smelled of bullshit and sulfur back when I first paid any attention to him. You know, and the more that you look, the more it becomes entirely obvious that this guy is extremely bad news. You know, this guy is the philosophical version of Barack Obama. Only he's worse because he's intentionally trying to manipulate the psychology of millions of young men across the West. Look, the media hates him and tries to... You're incredibly stupid. Incredibly stupid. The media did the same thing to George Bush. And you think that he wasn't a major player in the globalist movement? That's absolutely absurd. The media is actively elevating him as we speak. The intellectual dark web. Ooh. They even recycled Michael Shermer and Sam Harris from the New Atheists. I mean, these guys aren't even new. And so, the idea that this guy is even remotely on your side, the idea that he is even remotely sympathetic to the people of the West is absolutely absurd. I mean, when I first heard about Jordan Peterson and that sort of thing, I assumed that he was legitimate too. I said I had some generally nice things to say about him, not because I knew anything about him, but just because other people said all these good things about him. People that I like, people that I trust, Stefan Molyneux, John C. Wright, lots of good, smart people. But when you look a little deeper, when you actually bother to read the two books, The Maps of Meaning and the 12 Rule or the 12 Laws, and then you go and you read the UN agenda that he himself claims to have written the narrative for, there's no possibility of doubt anymore. There's no way to debate it anymore. The guy is bad news. The guy is very bad news. And he is one of the last people that you should want your sons, your brothers, your cousins, whatever, paying any attention to. Because what he is attempting to do is he is attempting to prevent the pendulum from swinging back. I don't think he can do it. I believe that these things are much bigger than any one person, than any one organization, no matter how influential or no matter how powerful. If you read War and Peace, there's a fantastic section about the Battle of Borodino. And it's really amazing because Tolstoy actually investigates the question of who won the battle. And he proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that at the three main nexuses of that particular battle, neither Napoleon nor the Russian general had any idea what was going on. They had no control. And so that's what I think matters. I don't think my opinion matters. I don't think your opinion matters. I don't think Jordan Peterson's opinion matters. I think that all those eminent persons on the UN-appointed panel, with all their grand plans for humanity, I think that they are going to be washed away in the tide of historical trends. Now, I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong about that. But I'm not wrong about Jordan Peterson. Once you catch that stink of dishonesty, it's like when you smell rotten milk or something. I mean, you just react to it. And there are certain things that people do. There are certain ways that people try to hide their intentions, the way they try to evade the truth, redefine words, that that they can't possibly be mistaken. they can't possibly be innocent. It's not naive. And the problem is that when you've got somebody who hides behind as much baffle-gab and bullshit as Peterson does, it's difficult to pin him down. I mean, it's kind of incredible to see how much squishiness and evasiveness there is in his writing, so that it's hard to see exactly where the falsehood is. And it's only if you have a sufficiently holistic understanding of the whole thing that you suddenly realize the whole thing is bullshit. I mean, I would mention this on the blog, but I was reading Umberto Eco's The Tree in the Labyrinth, which is a series of essays about encyclopedias. And he talks specifically and goes into considerable detail about how Aristotle utilizes metaphor to uncover new information, and he also talks about empiricism back in that time frame. Well, Jordan Peterson, in the 700 whatever pages of Maps of Meaning, doesn't ever once directly mention Aristotle. He doesn't ever mention Thomas Aquinas. He doesn't ever mention Augustine. Now, these are major, major omissions. But the reason that they're significant is because Peterson also makes claims saying that until 500 years ago, people thought entirely differently. They didn't think about things, they thought about stories. They thought in terms of narrative, not scientifically. Well, that's utter nonsense. The only way you could possibly say that is if you are 100% unfamiliar with Aristotle. Another remarkable thing he said is that medieval people were not familiar with rhetorical speech. Now, rhetorical speech is merely a form of persuasion. Now, I'm the first to admit that the Italians tend to be a little bit lost when it comes to sarcasm. But like one of the commenters just said, read Shakespeare and tell me that people didn't understand rhetorical speech. Now, granted, Shakespeare is Renaissance era, not medieval era. But if you actually read medieval documents, it's pretty clear that medieval people understood the difference between rhetoric and dialectic, or at least as well as we do today, especially considering that Aristotle defined the difference between rhetoric and dialectic 2,500 years ago. Now, granted, some of the writings were, Aristotle's writings were lost for a period of time. They were not generally known for a period of time. But the point is that people did not magically start thinking differently 500 years ago. Virtually no one thought the world was flat. And while they may not have figured out some things like perspective, and they may not have figured out how to make heavier than air objects fly, that doesn't mean that they were less intelligent than we are. And it doesn't mean that they fundamentally thought differently than we do. And if you have read things that are written from the medieval era, if you've read things that are older than the medieval era, like, for example, the Tale of Genji, or some of the Japanese literature, it becomes very, very clear that human nature and the way that people think is not very different than the way we think today. And so, the upshot is that there's no question any longer. It is easily confirmable that Jordan Peterson is a globalist shill. And it is obvious that the false philosophy that he is pushing, the con job that he is attempting to pull, is completely and 100% deleterious to the West. It is bad for America. It is bad for Americans. It is bad for every Western European nation. And so, if you think that, what George Soros and John Podesta and all those folks are doing is a good thing, so be it, fine. But at least George Soros is doing this openly. He's not hiding his intentions. Jordan Peterson, on the other hand, is a snake. Jordan Peterson is the modern philosophical equivalent of the serpent in the Garden of Eden that is the West. And like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, he is attempting to destroy the inhabitants. Have a good evening. Feel free to stop by the blog and leave your comments. We'll see you then.